Welcome to St. Paul's Cathedral for the opening of Just Water 2017. Particular welcome to you if you're joining us via our live stream. Melbourne has seen a deluge of water this afternoon, which may well have prevented some of us from attending in person, because I understand that there are significant problems in public transport and on the road network, but we're delighted that you who are here with us tonight have braved the rain and are with us now. It falls to me to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the people of the Kulin Nation. For the people of the Kulin Nation, water was and is a source of life, is a lifeline. It was the source of their daily food. It was a source of the ability to trade and travel. And so this place, at the meeting point of what then were Yarra Flats, is important, not just for the Wurundjeri people, the people who have the land to the north of us, but also to the four other traditional nations of the Kulin Nation who came together here to meet and trade. So in this place where water is both rich and scarce, we give thanks for those who have been the traditional owners of this land in generations past, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to Aboriginal people who are joining us either here in person tonight or via our live stream. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Heather PATACCA, who will introduce our speakers.
Well, in this humid weather, it's very easy to give a very warm welcome to you all to this, our first session of the Just Water 2017 conference here at St. Paul's Cathedral, the home church for Anglicans in Melbourne and around Victoria. Just Water is an international water conference hosted around the world by St. Paul's Cathedral London, Trinity Church Wall Street, and St. George's Cathedral Cape Town in South Africa, with the aim of lifting our voices in the cause of water justice around the time of World Water Day, which is in fact tomorrow. The day is observed internationally as an opportunity to learn more about water-related issues, to be inspired and to tell others and to take action to make a difference. The need for water is universal. Access to clean water is an essential human right, yet such access is increasingly compromised by droughts, pollution, rising tides, and flooding. And these effects, some due to climate change, are most tangibly felt by the very people the Christian gospel urges us to look to, the marginalised and the vulnerable. Many of us take access to fresh water for granted when we turn on the tap, in a way that those who walk for hours to draw water from a stream cannot. Water is necessary as air to sustain life in all its forms. As we think about it, it raises for us issues of justice and equity, as well as being rich in theological meaning. It's not just scientists and environmentalists who have responsibility to say something about water and its importance and act in accordance. As God has given responsibility for the stewardship of the earth to us, so we must be aware of how best we can be good stewards. So we are delighted to be able to welcome tonight some of Australia's keenest thinkers on water supply and related issues. They are in demand for their expertise, not just here in Australia, but also all around our blue planet. And to introduce them and to moderate our discussion this evening, I'd like to welcome Tim Thwaites, who many of you will have heard on ABC Radio. Tim is a science writer, broadcaster, long ago a zoologist, and also a teacher. So welcome, Tim. Please come to the microphone, won't you?
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Heather. Good evening, all. Before we start, could I please ask that people turn off mobile phones or any other devices that beep or flash or might irritate your neighbour. And if all this water talk begins to get to people and you feel that you need to make your own water, the toilets are over here in the northeast. Water, it's absolutely essential to our lives. Directly, it makes up something like 60% of our bodies, and it's the medium in which the reactions of life take place. We need to drink about 2 litres of it a day in some form or other, and we need a lot more to keep clean and for sanitation. It takes about more than 3 weeks to die of hunger. It takes a matter of just a few days to die of thirst. It's so critical to our existence that astronomers use it as the first sign they consider when searching for extraterrestrial life. Indirectly, it's used for cooking, washing, cleaning, agriculture, maintenance of the environment, energy production, mineral exploitation, industry, recreation, among other things. Yet we in Australia live on the world's driest inhabited continent. About 3/4 of our country is rated as arid or semi-arid, and the outback has one of the lowest rainfalls in the world. So we are constantly surrounded by issues of how best to make use of this limited and patchy resource that we have. For instance, in no particular order, we've recently had a suggestion that we bolster our energy production by dramatically expanding the Snowy River Hydro Scheme. That's an interesting thought, given the long-standing arguments over how we apportion and use the waters of the Murray-Darling Basin. Recently, we've been through one of the longest droughts in recorded history, which not only focused our attention on water use, but it also induced the Victorian state government, among others, to build a desalination plant. Currently, there are bitter arguments over exploration for and exploitation of coal seam gas and its impact on water underground. Changes in water provision and distribution are an important facet of the whole climate change debate. Water is an important element in all our development decisions, especially in Northern Australia or the outback, because it's essential not only to communities, to develop communities, but also for agriculture and for resource exploitation. Much of Australia is becoming increasingly dependent on underground water, 2/3 of Perth's water supply, for instance. And there are already reports that in some areas we are using groundwater at a rate that exceeds its replenishment. And then there are constant issues of pollution, contamination, and access to water. And that's just locally. Worldwide, because of drought, the UN has just announced the worst famine crisis in its history, affecting more than 20 million people in countries including Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, and Nigeria. Water scarcity affects 2.8 billion people for at least 1 month out of every year. More than 1.2 billion people worldwide, that's 1 in 6, lack access to clean drinking water. And dirty water kills about 5,000 children a day. That's nearly 2 million a year who die for want of clean water and proper sanitation. So let's get stuck into it. And because we have 2 experts to stimulate our discussion, both from the University of Melbourne. On the far side, Professor John Langford, AM, from the School of Engineering, and closer to me, Professor Peter Rayner from the School of Earth Sciences. I'm first going to ask each of them to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes on the topic of water issues for the 21st century. And after that, as this is a question and answer, we'll simply plunge into your questions of our speakers. There's a microphone down the front here, so perhaps the best thing to do is for you to queue up if you have a question to ask. So, without further ado, let me introduce Professor John Langford, who's a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering and of the Institution of Engineers Australia, and a visiting professor of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He's been involved in 3 cooperative research centres to do practical research to do with water and its management. But he's not only an academic, he's worked at senior level in the water industry for more than 35 years at Melbourne Water and its predecessors, at the Rural Water Corporation and its forebears, and also has been a Murray-Darling Basin Commissioner. Professor John Langford.
Behind a lectern. Can you hear me up the back? Yes. You can hear me? Good. Okay. Well, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to some of my predecessors in the water industry. But first, you need to remember that we have very short memories when it comes to water. When it's dry, we think it'll never rain again, and we panic. And when it's wet, we think it'll never be dry again, and we get complacency. So we have periods of complacency followed by panic. And it's how we behave in the panic that really determines the result. Now, our forebears made 2 very important decisions driven by a crisis. We had a gold rush. We had 500,000 people out there. No water supply, no pipe water supply, no sanitation, no garbage collection, no roads. They were living in tents. Can you imagine what that was like? The water supply was out of a rock bar that's under Queen Street Bridge, and they had pumps where Flinders Street Station is. No treatment, cholera, typhoid, everything rife. So one thing they did was to divert the waters of the Plenty River into Yan Yean and run a pipe down to Eastern Hill, and they sealed off the catchment. No agriculture, no access, no hiking, nothing. Water supply. And we've got a very pure water supply. Until the 1970s, it wasn't even chlorinated, which was unusual. The other thing that was done was to sewer this city. They had a Royal Commission, a Royal Sanitary Commission, because the public and the scientific community had worked out that a lot of disease was caused by waterborne organisms, following Pasteur. It took quite a while for that to seep through the political consciousness, but once it did, they acted, and they sewered this city in a period of 10 years, and they built the Werribee Sewage Farm, which is now on the Ramsar list of important wetlands, and if you're a bird observer, I'd be happy to take you out there and show you what it's like. It's paradise. So 2 things, that's protected Port Phillip Bay, and the protected catchments have protected us. Okay, now, you all expect me to talk about the desal plant, and I will, but I must admit, when they decided to turn it on, I thought that was the best rain dance that anybody has ever done, and so it turned out. I've been at meetings with ministers with umbrellas announcing water restrictions. It just seems to come with the territory. So, as time went on, our Australian water managers realised we had one of the most variable climates on the planet. Our stream flow is extremely variable. We have these prolonged droughts, we have these floods, and sometimes nothing much in between. There's a famous photograph of one of my predecessors, Sir Ronald East, and he's standing in the Murray River in 1926, and he was a short man, he would have been about that high, and between his legs was flowing the Murray River. If there'd been no irrigation, it would have been up to his waist. And that event convinced him to provide secure water for the irrigators so that it could grow food and they wouldn't have the disruption of running out of water and their crops dying. He just got into building dams to hold the water for extended periods to address these prolonged droughts. And of course, the Depression and the Second World War intervened, but in the 50s and 60s and 70s, in the Murray-Darling Basin and in Melbourne, very large storage reservoirs were built with the idea of holding water for long periods of time so that when we had a drought, we had access to water. And people never really complained that we'd invest a lot of money in these large dams and they were sitting there with water in them, not doing anything, and that water was waiting for the next drought. That was the strategy we had. Now, in 1975, and I'll just flip to the other side of the country, the city of Perth noticed changes in the stream flow input to their reservoirs. All the very wet years disappeared. All the years above the previous average disappeared. And over a period of time, the flows into those reservoirs went down in steps and stairs. To this day, Perth is working on a water supply strategy in which it gets nothing out of its dams. Okay. Now, last 2015, they had a flow of 11 gigalitres, that's 1 billion litres, into their dams, and they had 15 gigalitres of evaporation from their dams, so -4. Okay. Not a very good thing to happen. Okay. Now, one thing that comes out of this is that in the hydrological cycle, you might have, say, 100 units of rainfall and, say, 80 units of evapotranspiration and a small residual, 20. These are hypothetical figures. So if the rainfall goes down by 10%, you've halved the stream flow. So water is one of the first things we're going to see being affected by climate change, as has occurred in Perth. Okay, so the wet years disappeared. They were the years we got water into our dams that we could hold. There's nothing more destructive to our basic strategy than that occurring. So Perth now has 2 desalination plants. I'm assured they're wind-powered, although there's some controversy about that. So wind-powered desalination. Peter, you might know Peter Newman in Perth. That was his view. So about half of Perth's water supply is coming from desalination. They're treating their sewage effluent to drinking water standards and pumping it into the coastal aquifers because they've been using groundwater, I would say unsustainably, and they want to prevent seawater intruding into those aquifers, but in time that water will come into their drinking water system, so potable recycling of water. At the moment, the capacity is about 28 gigalitres a year, whereas the desal plants are about 145. Okay, so there's Perth. Coming to Melbourne, and sometimes it's a bit easier if you've got a PowerPoint or whatever, but I'll do this with my voice and my hands. Australia is surrounded by 3 oceans. The Southern Ocean, we have the Pacific Ocean to the east, and to the northwest, the Indian Ocean, all of which affect our climate. There's El Nino, La Nina in the Pacific, you've probably heard of. There's an Indian Ocean dipole, which affects similar to the El Nino, La Nina. If it's negative, brings moisture to Australia. If it's positive, it takes it away. And if we have a negative Indian Ocean dipole and a La Nina, we get a massive amount of moisture to northern Australia and we have very wet summers. Okay. We have the southern annual mode that zips around Antarctica. If it's positive, moves north, negative, south. So all those things interact to produce a very variable climate. And superimposed on this, we have a Hadley cell that goes round the equator, air rising at the equator, spiralling around the equator. And there's strong evidence that that's expanding and it's strengthening what's called the subtropical high pressure ridge. And if you look at our weather maps, you'll often see a string of highs and cold fronts between them. So the mean sea level in that ridge is increasing, and it's related to global temperature. Over the last 100 years, you can plot increasing global temperatures, and you can plot the strength of that subtropical high pressure ridge, okay? Also, the strength of that ridge is forcing our westerly system south, so we're getting less rain from the southwest, particularly in the cool season between March and October. On the other hand, the tropical influences that come from the northwest, and poor old Perth doesn't get them because if you draw a line northwest from the Kimberley, they're out of it, then increasing rain from the northwest, decreasing rain from the southwest, the stuff from the northwest usually in summer. So it's not particularly good for filling our dams. Okay, so in 1997, the wet years started disappearing from this part of the world. And we had the worst drought in the recorded history. I've got figures of all sorts of things. It was far worse than the Federation drought. It was beyond anything anybody who'd looked at our historical record could have imagined. So it certainly caught us all by surprise, you might say. So Melbourne storage has got drawn down to mid-20s. Now, zero is not zero, because zero is the lowest sill and the lowest outlet of those reservoirs. If you go to zero, you can't get a drop out of it. Zero is closer to 10%. So we had about 15%. There are about 5 years in the previous 10 that would have emptied that storage. One more dry year, and we would have been carrying buckets, not to water the garden, but to fill the bath. It would have been something that this city has never, ever seen. So, it got drawn down, 2006, massive reduction, 20% in the storages in 1 year, from a manageable situation to a full-blown crisis. What to do? Well, you're trying to insure yourself against one more dry year. With the catchments exceptionally dry, that was a high probability. So you need something that's going to produce a large volume of water when it's dry. That's the problem. So I'll leave it up to you to work out what you might do, but you certainly need very large volumes of water, and you need it when it's dry. Okay, so I'll let you think about that. That's the problem. And we'll come back in the discussion and talk about it. How am I going for time, by the way? Still fine?
Yes, you've still got 10 minutes or so.
10 minutes? Oh, God, I can keep going. All right, so one other thing happened in the city that might surprise you. In 1982, we had a drought, because you'll be immediately thinking we should make more efficient use of water, which is a really good thing. A drought in 1982, Thompson Reservoir just been built. People said, why did you build that? It's not going to fill. Just used to this controversy. Sugarloaf, why did we build that? Somebody complaining about the Perth to Kalgoorlie pipeline. Water didn't appear immediately. It took about 3 weeks to get there. So the poor guy, C.Y. O'Connor, committed suicide because he was harassed so badly. Anyway, we come back to 1982, drought, running out of water. We'd used most of the dam sites that were cost effective that we could build. What are we going to do? So we persuaded the authorities to go for demand management. So at that time, dual flush toilets, and I can claim personal responsibility for writing the regulations that made them mandatory. Like Henry Ford in his car, you can have any colour you like as long as it's black. You can have any toilet you like as long as it had 2 buttons. And that's reduced the volume involved in flushing a toilet over a day from 11 litres to 4. And you think of the water saving in that. User pays water pricing, used to pay for water on a property tax. And it's only the poor in low value properties that even got an excess, so-called excess water charge. So the property tax was removed and a fixed charge size of the metre and a volume. So 80% of your water bill now is a pay-for-use arrangement. That and all sorts of publicity campaigns. Don't be a Wally with water. I helped get that going. It was all very good until I got a boss called Wally, and then I had to stop. So the net effect of 30 years of campaigns, and I must say I'm a little disappointed it's not as active as it might be now, this city today is using the same volume of water as it did 30 years ago with 2 million more people in it. The water use per person has just been progressively coming down. A good news story, and I'm sure not many people in Melbourne even know that it's happened. So that is fundamental to us. Okay, I probably got time to go for the Murray-Darling. If I go back far enough, in 1829, the Chief Justice of the colony of South Australia drowned in a whaleboat trying to get through the entrance of the Murray. Now, why might that be important? Because if the Murray had been navigable, it would have been managed by the Commonwealth government, not the states. The Mississippi River is managed by the national government in Washington. In fact, it's managed by the Corps of Engineers. So if the Murray mouth had been navigable, management of the Murray-Darling would have been simpler. So 15 years it took to get a River Murray Commission, 4 commissioners. They all had to agree before anything happened, which was good in one sense, that if they did agree, even hard decisions, it would happen. But it took a long time to get there. Move forward to 1987, we were turning into a pillar of salt because of all the irrigation and land clearing. River Murray Commission couldn't do anything about salt, and the whole situation ended up in a logjam. So they reformed Murray-Darling Basin Commission, whole river basin. They developed a salinity and drainage strategy, which has actually worked. The salinity target at Morgan has been met in 2010. So there's another good news story. However, we'd diverted far more water than was there. In 1994, if we added up the amount of water that was being used for irrigation, it would be about 10,000 gigalitres, average flow about 14. But if we added to the 10,000 in use, there was another 6,000 that had been allocated. So 16,000, 14,000 resource. We'd allocated more water than was there. Big fuss, cap on diversions. Then comes the drought, and the Commonwealth decides to take over. It had to use its external affairs powers because under our constitution, if it is not mentioned in the federal Commonwealth Constitution, it belongs to the states. Water belongs to the states. So the Commonwealth used their foreign affairs power over international treaties like Ramsar. They also used their telecommunication powers because the irrigators order water over a telephone. It's a bit dicey, but they got there. So we now have a basin plan that is going to, if it's followed, reallocate 2,750 gigalitres of water from consumptive use, basically irrigation, into an environmental water holding. This is an unheard of thing to be doing. Internationally, people are looking at us and saying, you're doing what? 2,000 gigalitres has already been secured by purchase and by, for example, decommissioning Lake McCowan, a dam near Benalla. I could go on, there's a lot of stories about this. But the crunch is going to come in 2019 when they have to hit this target. Now, the basin plan and these sustainable diversion limits were put through the Gillard government with bipartisan support. Can you imagine that? Bipartisan support, so it obviously has a lot of political support, but you watch in the next 3 years as that date approaches. So water secured for the environment, and hopefully that will lead to a healthy Murray River. And at that point, I might stop. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Professor Peter Rayner, who's a climate scientist at the University of Melbourne. He's also worked at the CSIRO, the National Centre for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, at Princeton University, and at the Laboratory for the Science of Climate and the Environment in France. His particular interest is in the processes that add and remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, especially the role of human emissions and removal by land plants. So he works where climate and energy and water all meet. He's director of the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub, a group of 4 universities commissioned by the federal government to investigate how to improve cities, with emphasis on air quality, urban green space, livability and diversity. So with that background, I'm guessing he's going to talk to us a little bit about how climate change will affect the future water supply and distribution in this city. Professor Peter Rayner.
So we're something of a double act tonight. We're talking about many different aspects of the same kind of story. I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about the interaction of water, climate, plants, and people. I was going to add rivers to that story, but that's been so well covered off that I'm just going to talk a little bit about the interaction of the cycle of water and the environment. Now, when most people think of water and water shortages, they tend to think of thirst. They think of deserts, and they think of people dying of thirst, if you like, which indeed can happen. But when I hear about water shortages, I think of plants and the interaction of how those plants behave as water is limited, and of how that's going to affect people's long-term health and sustainability. In general, if people get thirsty, it's a system failure. Although we need a steady supply of water every day to live, we don't need a great deal of it. And it should generally be possible for a functioning system to get enough water to people to keep them alive, at least as far as water is concerned. It doesn't always happen, and it usually doesn't happen because of human failure, a siege, a war, a complete breakdown of the government, an overuse of a resource that was perhaps balanced at some time in the past. It's a failure of the system. It's not generally a problem that's firmly based in the physical environment. It's also true in Australia. In general, as John's pointed out, it's been possible through a combination of hard work, some clever campaigning on demand, and some increasingly innovative and occasionally expensive methods of gaining water to keep water up to our cities, even though the population of those cities is increasing an enormous amount. So when we think about any sort of water crisis in Australia, as John alluded to towards the end, it's much more to do with agriculture than it is to do with cities. We can keep water to our cities. It just has to be, it might be an expensive solution, but it can be solved. It's worth remembering that most of the water we take in, we eat. We don't drink it directly. It's the water that's embodied in our food which we have to think really hard about. Even elsewhere in the world, drought is much more a cause of famine than it is usually a cause of direct death by thirst. It's hard to keep water up to your livestock and your plants. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the beautiful and I think theologically fascinating interacting cycles of water and carbon and growth of plants, and what that means in the context where climate might be changing, and how that's going to affect us and what we might be able to do about that. So, a few comments on plants and water. Water's the bloodstream of plants. Tim made this point in the beginning with respect to our bodies, but it holds for plants as well. It's the medium in which the chemistry that they need to survive happens. It's also vital for their structure. You'll notice when lots of plants that are not used to the idea of running out of water do so, they wilt. Literally everything goes floppy, and that's because the kinds of pressure that keeps them firm and structured together has been withdrawn or lost, and they lose their structure. Plants like cacti and a lot of eucalypts that are used to this problem have different structures in their leaves that manage to maintain these even under dry conditions, so that they're structurally adapted to deal with limited water. Water is also part of plants' food, although it's not usually a limit. Plants combine carbon dioxide, water and energy to produce plant tissue, which is kind of this is the driving mechanism. It's the underlying base energy source for all of terrestrial ecology, for agriculture, and indeed for the kind of cycle of life as we know it. It's this photosynthetic reaction that combines CO2, water, and energy. The question is, how do they get that carbon dioxide? And they take it from the atmosphere, and they take it through small holes in their leaves. At the same time, there's a lot more water inside a plant than there is outside. And so each time they take in a carbon dioxide molecule, there's a pretty good chance they're going to lose some water. And so imagine what happens as it becomes hotter and drier in the middle of the day, or in a drought, or in the summer. The plants have to find a mechanism to preserve their precious water. And so what they do is they close these holes. And so that means that it's harder for them to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And at this point, I'll make a digression into my day job as somebody who studies the global cycles of carbon, and point out that only about half of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere each year from burning fossil fuels and deforestation actually stays there. The rest is removed by land plants and by the ocean. We think it's a little uncertain, but about a quarter of our fossil fuel emissions are removed by land plants each year. It might be a little bit more than that. When there's a drought, that process becomes much less efficient. So each time it becomes hotter and drier, the rate of increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up. And we can see this. It was one of the first things that was noticed when people started studying the history of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is that every time there was a serious El Nino and a global scale, a large scale drought across various key ecosystems in the world, there was a spike in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it suddenly would shoot up. And then we'd have a wet year, and it would decrease. So we see that there's this very strong coupling between the cycles of carbon and the cycles of water. And water stands at this critical connection point between the terrestrial ecology and climate. Now let's imagine what happens with climate change. We expect it to get warmer. Indeed, it has got substantially warmer in the last 100 years. And that, given the story I just told about what we might expect leaves to do under these circumstances, has people quite worried that the ability of plants to be cleaning up after us is going to be affected largely by the limitation of water for these plants. So the fact that the plants have difficulty retaining their water supply in an increasingly warm world may mean that climate change can accelerate a little faster than we thought. Now, we're really keenly watching for evidence that this might be happening. So far, we haven't seen it. We don't expect to see it too seriously yet, but it's one of these things that keeps climate scientists awake at night. The idea that there might be some sort of water-mediated feedback, water-mediated increase in the relationship between climate change and the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, John's already pointed out that one of the things that's going to happen with climate change is not just a warming, but a changing in the patterns of rainfall. And in general, the intensification of the Hadley cell that he mentioned, we can summarize this without the science talk as the wet gets wetter and the dry gets drier. And there's already pretty strong evidence of that happening across the world and indeed in Australia. It's not unambiguous, but there appears to be evidence that northern Australia, tropical northern Australia, is actually getting wetter. And as John pointed out, there's very strong evidence indeed that parts of southern Australia are getting drier, in some cases a lot drier. This is also happening globally. So we are always curious about whether these large-scale droughts, such as the one we're observing in East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula at the moment, are a responsibility of climate change, or whether they're just part of the natural variability that we see. And the best evidence we have is that we can't attribute any particular event to climate change, but we can say that the chance of it happening has been substantially increased by climate change, and we think that's the case. Now, the problem comes when we think about who is most seriously affected by these droughts and what they should do about it. And Tim made the point at the beginning that one of the problems of drought is that it most predominantly affects the most vulnerable people. We can spend our way around a drought to a fair degree. Lots and lots of people in the world cannot. And indeed, the methods that we might use to spend our way around this problem in much more complicated environments are themselves a cause of a problem. So we might increase irrigation. We might build some more dams. If that river that we're damming happens to flow through several other countries, they might have words to say about that. A friend of mine who studied water law in the US made the joke that if the Western US had been 20 countries rather than 20 states, the war over the Colorado River would never have stopped. And a concern of political scientists is that water is going to be a major source of dispute under climate change into the future. So there is a fair chance that climate change is going to drive conflict over water. There's also the question as to whether increasing use of various forms of renewable energy is going to exacerbate or improve this problem. And that depends on a whole range of engineering choices that one might make about how to deal with an energy source like that. So we've noticed that there is a very close link between the cycle of carbon and the cycle of water through plants and through the rest of the terrestrial biosphere. And that is kind of the central cycle that describes the way life on land, at least, actually works. We also know that both those cycles have been perturbed, that we have done a lot to change how water flows, where it's stored, how it's used, where it moves, and we've done a fair bit to change the way carbon that used to be stored quietly underground as fossil fuel is suddenly being redistributed to the atmosphere, changing the climate and itself changing the way water is distributed on the planet. So the question is, what can we do about this? There's no point wishing climate change away. Some of it has happened, and a good deal more is going to happen due to an object, a phenomenon called committed warming that I won't go into here. But for a little while, we are going to have to ride out the effects of climate change. I'm going to finish up this with some good news, by the way. But we do have to learn to adapt. And one of the things I think we need to learn is what to worry about. We've been, as John's pointed out, really quite successful in reducing our direct demand for water in cities. But we also need to think a bit more about our demand for the kind of water that's embodied in various products that we use. What we eat and what we wear have perhaps a lot to say about the amount of water that our lifestyle actually needs to support it. The next thing we have to do in dealing with climate-related effects on water, of course, is to deal with climate change itself. And that's a long story. We have rarely a week goes by without some news about how we may or may not deal with that, how it interacts with the topic I haven't discussed today, which is energy. And there's a lot to be said about the interaction between energy, food, and water, and climate, which is a larger topic, as much to do with how humans behave as about the physical nature of the climate and the Earth. In general, though, we are going to have to deal with climate change if we're going to keep the long-term water problem manageable. And for this, we actually have some quite good news. Confirmed again in this week that emissions globally were flat again last year, and that's the third year in a row that's happened. Now, that is, at least locally for various countries, a remarkable achievement. It's meant that they've been able, for example in China, to keep their emissions slightly reducing while still growing their economy quite rapidly. So there is some evidence that humans can at least start to think their way around this apparent roadblock of can we reduce emissions, can we unpick this difficult interaction between climate and water while maintaining the kind of economic growth that we've become rather used to. It's been done despite the fact that the policies that we think we need to deal with this problem haven't really kicked in yet. We haven't really started to act. However, people are acting on what they know we're going to need to do. The way I would put this is that we've set foot on a very long road, but we haven't gone very far yet. We're going to have to do a great deal more than that, and as I've already said, the water problem is not going away in a hurry. The interaction of water and climate change is going to be with us for a while, but I believe that we're starting to see evidence that we are at least taking that problem seriously and starting to take the steps on the underlying driver of this problem, the underlying driver of climate change, that we might need to address the problem long term. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. It's now time for some questions. And we have here a microphone at the front. I think possibly the easiest way of sorting through the questions is if you've got a question, perhaps you could initially raise your hand and then come towards the front, and people can queue up 2 or 3 deep. If people are amenable to that, I think it's probably the easiest way of handling. You, sir, have got a question already.
Philip Rollins, thank you for speaking. I've really appreciated what you've both said. John, I was most appreciative of what you said about the reduction in water in cities like Melbourne. I think it's always fantastic to hear news where we're progressing. My question is related to the cleanliness of water on a world scale. You know, there was some mention made of the coal process of extracting gas through coal seams and all the anxiety. I know some communities are putting up about that. Where do you see the future in accessing clean water, in turning back the effects of a planet with 7 billion people and a huge toxic load through chemicals and the like? Where do you see the solution there?
Well,
Question addressed to both men, if I may, yeah. But,
how do we get access to clean water? Well, the City of Melbourne has done that, but we just can't afford to shut off large areas and do this. There are cities around the world like in New York and the cities in the Pacific Northwest, Vancouver or Seattle, that do practice that, but we have to pay a lot of attention to the regulation of water quality. I travel a lot to China and their rivers smell like the main outfall sewer, and so you need some regulation about what, and frankly we're complicit in that because we've exported a lot of our polluting industries like textiles and things like that to China, so we can't say, look, we're pure and clean. So there needs to be, I think, a broad-scale initiative of which that basin plan is part of, because keeping a healthy ecology can help keep the water clean. It also requires people like the cotton industry to reduce the amount of herbicides and fertilisers. So this is a broad-based strategy because we can't take water for granted, but we're never going to get pure water in that river out there because it runs off a city. We can do quite a bit, but we're never going to turn it back to what it was in 1834. So a lot of things we can do and should do. Does that help you? Or?
Thank you very much. Appreciate your answer, yes. Thank you.
Peter. Steve.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is about plastic and one is about politics. Is the amount of plastic that's in the ocean an issue that affects water, or is it okay, it can just all keep going as it is, or is there an issue about water to do with all that plastic that's in the ocean? That's one question. And perhaps I'll just say the other one. And the other one is every issue today, most currently the energy issue, every issue is highly politicised. So is there any way that issues to do with water can be approached in a way that does not get caught up in the politicising, which seems to me to be absolutely unproductive? Do you have any suggestions about how that political question could get handled?
Peter, would you like to take the first one first? That's the question of plastics.
Yes, yep. So this is indeed a major problem. It's a problem that has marine biologists very concerned. They're concerned about a kind of collapse from the top of a range of ocean ecosystems where various forms of these plastics, and we're most concerned here, what people talk about most spectacularly, is plastic bags finishing up in the digestive tracts of large and attractive mammals and fish. But in fact, probably a greater worry is the chemical load as those plastics break down. It's a sad story that the use for a while of biodegradable plastics turned out to simply shift that problem out of vision, where these plastic films broke down from large pieces into microscopically small pieces. And the chemical load that that's causing in various ecosystems is becoming a significant worry for our marine ecologists. It's not a problem for water per se, except that it forms part of an assault that we're making invisibly on aquatic ecosystems. And it'd be interesting to hear John talk a bit about environmental flows and what we think we've done to riverine ecosystems over time. But the problem with the catch with environmental damage done to water is to aquatic ecosystems, it's much harder to see. And so things can often get much more serious before we know we have a problem. And the ocean plastics problem is an absolute storyline case for that. We now have a very serious problem. It's hard to imagine how on earth we can clean it up. We're stuck with it for a long time, and our major task at the moment is we're in something of a hole and we really should stop digging.
John, is there a problem in terrestrial waters of this nature as well?
Yes, and particularly in cities. You could probably go down a few hundred metres down the Yarra and you would see a trash rack collecting plastic bottles and God knows what else. Or if you go to an urban stream after there's been a thunderstorm and the water's gone up, you'll see plastic bags hanging in trees and all sorts of things. So,
but isn't it the smaller amounts of plastic that are the real, the particles?
Well, if you want me to get basic, you know those little tags you put on apples, right? They're the bane of the people who treat Melbourne sewage, those things. They go to everything, drive them nuts. But you try and tell the food industry to use a biodegradable label. No, it costs too much. Anyway, so I think I'll get back to politics. Now, if you think you're going to separate water and politics, you're not going to do it. The Chinese word for politics, or the character for politics, strictly it's governance, but it's near enough to politics, combines the Chinese character for rivers with the Chinese character for levees, levee banks. I don't know whether you know the Yellow River in China, sediment. They put it in levee banks and the bed of the river is now about 13 metres, about right up in those arches there, above the floodplain. And that river wanders over the floodplain, the distance between Sydney and Melbourne. And some emperor had to decide where that river was going to go. So you can see why those two characters turn into politics. You can imagine it's not going to be in my backyard. But I actually think we have a strategic problem in Australia, not only Australia, but the boundary between the political and the professional has got distorted in favour of the political. You've got a Prime Minister trying to design an electricity network. You've got all sorts of things like that. Now, in the early 20th century, they tried to solve that, and they made my predecessors appointed by the Parliament. And they made the railway commissioners appointed by the Parliament because the politicians were building railway lines to every marginal seat in the state. And they were sensible enough to recognise that something had to happen. But that placed more power in the hands of the professionals, some would say bureaucrats and whatever. And over time, that was broken down. The Board of Works was demolished in 1994, the State Rivers in 1984, Victorian Railways disappeared, the SEC, blah, 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 blah. So, to me, I can see attempts to get over that by bodies like Infrastructure Australia. So you have a professional body like the Productivity Commission who are assessing these major infrastructure projects to a rigorous economic and environmental and social template, and they're providing the politicians with a menu of choice so that if they start making political trade-offs, everybody can see it. But of course, you know, there are ways and means of subverting that as well. But I really do think we've got to get much better at handling this. But I think the political situation is getting harder. One side does something, the other side bag it. Whereas perhaps in the past they might have got together and decided to do something in the long-term interest of the country rather than use it as political weapons. But for what it's worth, we've got a problem and we need to fix it. I'm not sure how.
Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that if we'd substituted energy for water in John's last sentence, last discussion, we would have come out with a very similar story, and they kind of vie for each other as this wicked political, professional, bureaucratic problem that the people that I work with around in the city space are continually trying to navigate policies that they think have a chance of being accepted. And for mine, that's rather a pity that policy options from really quite low levels in the bureaucracy now have to take account of what has a chance of getting through the minister's office and the kind of political gatekeepers. So I agree absolutely with John. I must say, extremely impressed with the quality of the federal and state bureaucracies that I've dealt with. That's an extremely unfashionable thing to say, but the kind of, given the constraints they're working under, the kind of careful attention that gets paid to things is, for someone who's come to this as an outsider, quite impressive, difficult, and still not always with the kind of depth that an academic would like, but academics tend to be very deep and very narrow people. That's what they pay us for. And so I think that the quality of thought and advice is available to the political system. I occasionally with politicians who think that there is capital to be gained, or kudos to be gained by opposing something that they think is a good idea, will just keep quiet. It's perhaps difficult to expect them to support each other. That's not the kind of adversarial system that we're brought up on. But even just keeping out of the way from time to time. The beauty of silence is perhaps underplayed in politics.
Okay. Do we have any further questions? Yeah.
Melbourne's second Anglican bishop, James Morehouse, his inspiration was responsible for this cathedral. He outraged people in the 1880s by refusing to join in prayers for rain in the time of a drought. And he gained some notoriety by his statement, "Don't pray for rain, damn it." I think for much of our history we could have added to that, and when you damn it, make people pay realistically for using it so they don't waste it. Now, recently we did undergo a change in the way we pay for our water, and I guess that would have had some effect on the amount of water being used, and I'm not sure whether you mentioned that when you listed the various things that have happened recently to encourage us to be more careful in our use of water.
Yes, I did actually mention the shift from paying for water on a property tax, the value of your house, which went until in this city the mid-1980s, when it was changed to a user pays, and now 80% of your bill is water by measure, even though the costs are probably like 70% fixed and 30% variable. I can't comment on the bishop refusing to pray for rain, but he should have built a desal plant.
Yep. Actually, that's just what I was going to get onto. My name's Chris Blake, but you brought up climate change and the problem of, for example, the likelihood of increasing droughts, and accompanying that, potentially you got onto positive feedback mechanisms, the potential for increasing aridification. I'm thinking particularly in places like the southeast of Australia and the west of the United States. What your thoughts are on the roles potentially of desalination in securing the future of water security for places that are potentially going to become drier for longer.
Right. Well, I could make a case that desalination, if it's powered by renewable energy and the seawater is drawn from a high energy source like Bass Strait or the Tasman Sea off Sydney, not the head of the Arabian Gulf or Spencer Gulf, because you're taking half the water out and putting half of it becomes drinking water, the other half goes back at twice the salinity of seawater. So you've got a problem of increasing salinity, for which that Wonthaggi plant would be about the size of a football field. And if you put the diffuses over a sandy bottom, so there are no adhered flora or fauna, things that just swim through it, it's sandy, then the environmental effect there is very small, and certainly a lot smaller than pulling water out of stressed rivers. And if you're worried about the energy to heat the water in your shower is about 5 times more energy intensive than desalinating water. It's about twice the potential efficiency. So we've got a lot of efficiency improvements in desalination. So I personally think we made the right call. We can argue about how big it is, and certainly we could argue about how it's financed. I don't agree with the way it was financed, but I think you'll find that's a very good insurance policy in time. And as far as turning it on, at the moment, the demand for water in this city is bigger than the supply, so the storage is just gradually going down. So turning it on is a reasonably sensible thing to do, and having it just producing 15 gigalitres, keeping it ticking over. One of the reasons they had trouble starting it is if you mothball it, all these membranes start to dry out and you start getting into a lot of trouble to restart it. So it's a lot easier if you just keep it ticking over, and then you can expand and contract the output. And the final point I'd make is it's much better to avoid a crisis, that is, to keep the storages up, than to allow them to be seriously drawn down and then turn it on. I don't think that's a sensible strategy at all, because if you get into a crisis, the options for what you can do are a hell of a lot narrower than if you've got time to think and do things over time.
Okay. Peter, do you have anything to say on desalination? Any thoughts?
Not really. I would just make the comment again about we need to think, when we're thinking about the interaction of water and climate, on how the agricultural system plays into this. So the desal plant is obviously a potential solution for cities, and there's a whole other range of problems that John's been involved in for a long time about how we deal with making sure that agriculture functions efficiently and with proper due respect for the environment. And in fact, if I get a second, John, I'm going to ask you about environmental flows before we finish, about whether you think, how we talk about that balance in keeping the rivers healthy versus what agriculture actually needs. You think we're not so much do we have the answer right, but are we going about the process the right way?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Prof. Langford said a bit about the limits on water storage and redistribution, but I wanted to ask, what do you really see in the future about the absolute limits? I mean, people are going to keep asking, why don't we build a big dam in the Northern Territory or whatever and pump it down south or irrigate Central Australia? But have we really more or less reached the engineering limits, so that you can do things like that? Or is it more a problem of the total amount of rainfall in a dry continent, and really there isn't much more scope for any redistribution of water, whether it's out of the Murray-Darling system or any other?
Well, water's heavy. If I put a pack on your back with 20 litres of water, you'd realise how heavy it is. And it's incompressible, so it's very energy intensive to transport. So once you get over 200 to 300 kilometres, you might as well build a desalination plant in terms of the energy and the cost. So shifting water from the Northern Territory to Melbourne or Perth, as Gerald Ernie Bridge, a former Minister of Water in Western Australia, wanted to do, is just bloody nonsense. And what are we going to do with the water anyway? If we make more efficient use of the water here, and there's plenty of scope to do that, why would we do that? Now, if I were in China, I would take a different view, because they have 500 million people on the North China Plain. who are depending on fossil water, 10,000 plus years old, groundwater, and it's going down about 1 to 2 metres a year. In fact, parts of Beijing are starting to settle because they've pumped so much groundwater out of it. And if you combine, 500 million people with the ones in the High River Basin, 800 million people running out of water. So they've built the water equivalent to the Great Wall. They built a south to north transfer scheme that would shift about the annual flow of the Murray. It is the most enormous piece of civil engineering I've laid eyes on relating to water. It is mammoth, and they're building 2 other major transfer schemes. Now, China has, similar to us, a distribution problem with water. The Yangtze River has an annual flow of 1 million gigalitres. The Murray's 14,000, so 1 million. So they've got a lot of water in the south. The Yellow River's about 60,000, so the north is dry. The north has got the people and the agriculture, and the south's got the water. But they're dealing with such a scale, frankly, I don't think they've got too many options. You'd had hundreds of desalination plants up and down the coast if you'd tried to produce the same volume of water with desalination. So frankly, I don't think they've got any choice. But we don't have 1.5 billion people, and we don't have the water problems those guys have got. So I don't think I'm going to see pipelines and whatevers. I'm going to see more interconnection in the southern Murray-Darling Basin, perhaps, but nothing from the Northern Territory here. Use it where it is. Although develop in the north, I think, is a southern myth, to be honest.
Okay. Peter, did you want to say anything about that? Are there any places, other places other than China, that where water movement would be a useful solution?
I'm probably not the right person to answer that. I probably don't have enough in my head of the map of water balance versus need across the globe. I know that there are various other places that have a distribution problem, but whether that distribution problem is soluble by actually transporting water is something that I don't know. I don't know, John, do you know whether there are any other, are there cases, say, in Northern Africa where...
Well, California has
Yep.
built some pretty heroic transfer schemes from the Colorado to Los Angeles.
I know this is an issue that some Canadians actually take very seriously.
Well,
that they actually think the Americans will eventually reach a stage where they will ask them, nicely of course, for their water.
Yes, I can understand that. The Colorado is in some bother. A large storage in a slowly drying environment. If you stress those systems too hard, they fall off a cliff, just as we've discovered, and the security drops sharply, and then you're in real bother.
And there's been a significant drying trend in the western US already, so the climate is not breaking well for them with that problem.
Do we have any further questions? Yes.
My name is Corinne Border. I was just wondering whether there are any grand schemes to actually increase precipitations, increase water. There are big schemes about to limit carbon emissions and to sequestrate CO2, but is there something equivalent, maybe on the global stage, to increase precipitations, like, I don't know, reforestation, for instance?
The short answer is yes, and they practice it in Tasmania, and they think they might still do it in the Snowy Mountains. That is to seed clouds, usually with silver iodide. And I was involved in trying to apply it to Melbourne. The challenge is it's no use for agriculture because when it's dry, the conditions that are conducive to seeding clouds aren't there. The best opportunities are when it's really wet. which creates a problem because you might be accused of creating floods. But if you have a big hole in the ground, like all the dams in Tasmania, you can use them to hold water from the wet periods for the dry. Same with the Snowy Mountains, a lot of storage there. We tried it in Melbourne, but the Thomson catchment, which is what we're aiming at, is sort of a fairly long, narrow catchment going north-south. And the rain at that time, the rain-bearing winds came from the southwest at right angles to that long, narrow catchment. And we had to seed about 70 kilometres upwind of the catchment, trying to drop the precipitation into that particular catchment. And we weren't particularly accurate, so it didn't work. The Chinese are actively pursuing rainfall modification using rockets. I'm not sure how successful they are.
Peter, do you know of any particular large-scale, seriously large-scale afforestation schemes or anything like that would...
Yes, so again, it's curious how often China turns up as everybody's big story in this area. But China is running still the largest reforestation program in the world. And one of their motivations for doing that is concerns about drying. So we know that there's an interaction observed between deforestation and changing rainfall patterns. Unpicking cause and effect there is tricky, and there's a bit of an argument in the scientific community about how much rainfall is overall reduced and how much is just moved, but there's enough likelihood that deforested landscapes change the circulation of the atmosphere enough that rainfall is overall reduced. And so there's several motivations for why one might do large-scale reforestation, but maintaining or increasing rainfall is certainly one of them.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. Yep.
I'm live tweeting as well, so I was just capturing what we were saying for those of us who are following us on Twitter. I'm really interested, Peter, in your comments, which make much sense to me about water being a major source of conflict internationally, and I've seen some of those effects, particularly in places like Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. What kind of international laws and frameworks do we need to shape in order to make sure that we don't see a great deal of water wars being fought in the next generation? Thank you.
Well, it's interesting you mention the Middle East because there's a lot of concern that the number of Syrian refugees that are now in Jordan, something like 1 million plus, and in Lebanon, both countries are very short of water, that they are really stressing the water resources, and those countries are not like us, reasonably wealthy and have well, we might not think it, a reasonably capable political system that can do things. It is really difficult. I'll just perhaps dodge the question by, do you know the derivation of the English word rival? In other words, competitor? It's people who share the same stream, okay? So we've got this bunch of rivals worried about sharing the water. And water, as we've found, is a very powerful effect. In the days of sieges of castles, the first thing they'd try and do is shut off the water. In fact, I think interfering with water supplies is a war crime, to be honest. Yeah. So, and actually I've interacted with the Palestinian and the Israeli water people, and by and large the water professionals have a sense of the public good, which is one of the things that attracts them. And there's quite a deal of cooperation. Well, there was 10 years or so ago when I was interacting with them, there was quite a deal of cooperation between the two groups. So, you know, you can be optimistic to a degree.
Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, I think there are relatively weak international frameworks for doing this. I don't think there's an equivalent of, say, the law of the sea around how one handles transnational rivers. So I don't think there are kind of international global conventions about this. I hope there might be a lawyer in the audience who can correct me. There are lots of places where catchments are kind of managed in some kind of collective way. And there are agreements about what one can and can't do, how much water one can take. But there's also always, I think, tensions between upstream and downstream countries. And I think certainly, at least at the news level, and John might know how much is happening behind the scenes, questions about the Mekong, for example, which flows through a bunch of countries. Exactly who gets to use how much of that water, how, is pretty broadly discussed. I know that in the security assessments that are done by lots of the kind of semi-public parts of the security establishment around various countries, the concern about exacerbating conflicts over water as both need for irrigation increases and potentially in various cases rainfall decreases is a they think, quite a likely vector for climate change related conflict.
Thank you very much. Heather.
Well, on behalf of us all, I'd very much like to express our thanks to Professor John Langford and to Professor Peter Rayner for their insights so generously shared, so well explained to us all. We're very grateful for your time, for your thoughtfulness, your wisdom, and also your extraordinary expertise. And to Tim Thwaites, many thanks for your skillful moderation, and our great appreciation to you also for your work this evening in helping us to understand further issues around water. And we'd also like to express a personal thank you to Canon Dr. Stephen Ames, who has worked tirelessly to bring together the program tonight. Many thanks to you. I think we'd all like to have a round of applause for all of you now. Thank you. Friends, we continue our program on Thursday morning at 10 a.m. when we join Trinity Church Wall Street for a worship service, and following that at 11 a.m. for a keynote address from former four-time US Senator Barbara Boxer, who is pretty much a specialist on issues around ocean and law. So we look forward to that. And that will be followed at 1:30 by a session on aid and water. All our sessions are free, but if you'd like to make a donation on your way out in the donation boxes to help us defray our costs, we won't complain about that. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Good night and safe home. Thank you.